Look, I know you covered this in your talk when we actually met physically at the World Marketing Forum in Melbourne, run by Juan Mendoza and the Martech Weekly crew. And I really liked your topic, which was called the death of digital attribution. And then you went through this timeline from 2004 all the way through to where we are today. It was really good. And plus, I definitely like the Simpsons references.
I think sometimes you choose something to identify yourself in your career, and sometimes it chooses you. But yeah, I think I've been talking about this sort of stuff for a decade now, which is a bit scary. But maybe sometime after this 3-part series will be done, attribution will actually be dead. But I don't think that will actually be true, unfortunately.
Well, either way, it's a nice headline, and you've got to sell the talk a bit, right? So, but I suppose it's the nuances that are they're everything here, and that's why people listen to this podcast. It's something I don't really shy away from, and that's why I was really interested in talking to people who have worked at companies and like concrete examples of transitioning from this digital attribution mindset to something more nuanced, which is really, really hard. And look, I've come across lots of small, medium, and large clients who have tried to do this, and often it's quite awkward, I notice. And there's a lot of politics and cultural change and mindset issues that have to occur first before that happens. So, but yeah, anyway, that aside, let's backtrack a tiny bit to where did your career start? You're at IAG, were you?
My sort of first foray into this is I actually was doing the website for Toyota. I was doing the web analytics for Toyota Australia, and I used to get the report of all the leads that would come in by these traffic sources. And I had no idea how that worked. And I was just like, that's amazing. I would love to understand how on earth they got to this point. And so I was doing all the reporting for Toyota Australia for their websites for a little while. And then I transitioned into a job at Insurance Australia Group where they had originally hired me because they had heard of this attribution problem. And they were just like, well, we just need someone to sort of like spend time thinking about it. And there's no one in Australia. So you just seem to know about web analytics. So we'll get you to come on board. And Insurance Australia was interesting because like insurance as a product, it's a historical product where it used to have a shop in a shopping center, and that's how they sold your insurance. And then the telephone products came along, and then the digital, so they have these sort of contact centers that or these different surfaces that you interact with to the product. And one of the things that I sort of discovered in the early stages of research for Insurance Australia Group in that attribution case is that the call center people thought what was happening was people were getting a price on the telephone and then buying it on the internet. And then you go talk to the internet team and they're like, no, what's happening are people are getting a quote on the internet, they're checking that the price is okay, and then they're calling and buying the product on the phone. And I'm just like, that's super interesting. Let's go figure out if we can build a statistical model to try and connect these actual two streams. And the answer is yes to both of them. But it's actually way more common for someone to do the quote on the internet first and then actually convert via the telephone, because no one likes that awkwardness attached to, like you can't afford it or something along those lines. And so we actually built one of the, as far as I know, in at least the Asia Pacific region, we worked with a vendor on an attribution model way back then, back when third-party cookies worked and you could do some of this stuff. But we actually had a model that allowed us to model out offline conversions via the telephone on what paid media sources they actually went through. And it was an incredibly powerful system because we got to talk to such authority. The call center people were like, oh, wow, okay, now we actually understand our value proposition in the context of this and this whole pathing idea. And so that was sort of the first interesting work that I did around attribution for sort of companies in a sense.
I love that because it reminds me of that Mark Tunis comic, which is like, who can claim the digital touch point? And there's this comic strip which Tom Fishburne does very well, and it's like every different department, social, search, TV, radio, are trying to claim credit for the successful result, but they're all siloed. And literally, like, customer behavior and CX is really complicated. And if you've ever worked in a space, it's generally never one touch point. It's like multi-dimensional or multi-channel, and it's really, really complicated. And that's kind of what the reality of what you're trying to get to the bottom of. But yeah, by default, I was going to go, hey, it was us.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was just so interesting and so powerful to be able to show it in a chart and trend it over time and stuff like that as well, where it allowed them to have a conversation rather than them to be pointing, nah, it's the other guy. So that was interesting.
And did you have any sort of blowback or issues trying to get the organization orientated around that? Or was it just an instant like, hey, we've got this really cool model, bang, everybody's using it, you're wrong, trust us?
I think it won over the perma teams, but the brand teams were still pretty far away from, like, brand is always the much more challenging end of the equation to bring into this like more modern world of measurement. And to be fair, even when third party cookies were good, it didn't give a very fair representation of the impact of brand marketing. And so they're very rightly, look, this is really interesting, but we still have all of our big pieces of work that we're going to care about there.
That's another can of worms, which we're going to open very, very soon around brand measurement. And I think you mentioned during your speech a very concise version of your career path, which is really interesting because when you first started Canva, I think they were more in that attribution world and you transitioned them away from that to a bit more of a complex model. And I think at the time when I came across Canva, actually one of our earlier episodes with the guys from impact.com around affiliate and sort of digital partnership offerings, I know Canva did a lot of affiliate links tracking back in the day, a lot of blogging, a lot of using content pieces and power users. So empowering people to create training manuals for other people. And you had this whole community around that. It was very much digital orientated. And what I've noticed is that even if startups start there and they do a really, really good job of that, eventually they hit some sort of constraints of growth and they might want to look at adding another channel. And especially if they add a channel that's less easy to manage than some of these digital ones, it creates this problem with the existing way of measuring things and attributing and budgeting and everything around that. And then you have to kind of create something new. So tell me what happened there at Canva.
We'll probably, I don't know if we've got time to talk about Facebook and attribution, but I was there for 4.5 years. Canva had not been doing marketing for a huge amount of time. It has been a product-led, it is still very much a product-led growth company. And marketing was always sort of this ads was sort of like this extra piece on the side that was always sort of done. So it's not this long story inside of Canva of how they've done stuff. But when I joined, they had gone down this journey of building a last touch attribution model, and then they were sort of starting to graduate into a multi-touch attribution model. And one of the challenges in this space is that Canva has a lot of people who use the product, and that means that you can't just like have Google Analytics doing all the processing for you. You have to build your own analytics processing solution. And one of the challenges about building your own click-through attribution model is that you actually have to do all the sessionization in SQL, and you have to do all of the credit allocation model in SQL as well. And so for a short period of time, it was one of the most expensive models in the entire data warehouse transformation process. You also ended a problem where, you provide this granularity of like John converted and decided to become an active user, and we would then attach this credit allocation model to all of these other reports within the company. And you'd have this case where someone would be talking about like a landing page and the activation between that landing page and the channel credit allocation model. And you're like, well, I mean, yeah, like I think you could cut the data that way, but it's really got some sort of challenges, and we're not really thinking about causality and stuff like that as well. So one of the first things that I tried to bring into Canva was the idea of ads experimentation. And what's interesting about ads experimentation is that, we've got Facebook and Google and Snapchat and TikTok who are all very happy to give you an experimentation around where they control the randomization and the treatment. But the thing you have to ask yourself in all of these publisher relationships, which is, what is the incentive structure here? When they're giving you one of these experiments, they're giving you an experiment at a certain spend point with a bunch of biases that, if you just come back to that idea of an incentive model, like no one at these tech companies is going to get a big bonus for producing a lift measurement solution that shows that publisher is not very good, right? And it's that whole idea of, you can vote all you want, but if you can pick the candidates, then it's not really much of a democracy in a sense, right? And one thing that I think is really important with ads experimentation is that it's important for the internal team to actually own that system, whether you are paying a vendor, whether you're using an open source solution, whether you're developing your own. The incentive structure of you running the experimentation yourself and designing the experiments yourself and sort of working with the publishers on that is incredibly powerful, because it realigns the incentives to the publisher trying to increase the performance of those ads so that it shows up inside of your experimentation, and your experimentation leads you to the business outcomes that you're trying to achieve, whether that's user growth or revenue or whatever you're looking for.
Yeah, I think the principal agent problem is very much plaguing everyone at a very meta level. So if we sort of just zoom out here, like, and generally most of these marketing investments are based on some sort of kind of measurement, no matter how accurate or inaccurate it is. And sometimes when you're hiring, a vendor then hires a publisher, and then you're kind of almost two steps removed from that whole process. So there's like a double disincentive, or double the principal agent problem kind of gets multiplied the more steps removed you are from that actual buy in the market. And of course, everybody is going to tell the next person up the chain that whatever they did was very, very good. And this is what you should be measuring. This is what you should be caring about. And that sort of like goes up the ladder back to the client. And eventually I find it's kind of like Chinese whispers. Whatever problems are downstream are multiplied as they go upstream.
And you're closest to the business, right? Like when you're a data science team inside of the business, you are really, really close to the business, and you have that to sort of think about and the incentive structure there. But then you're also trying to manage this third party sort of handshakes and stakes, a time honored sales strategy. As a data science team who cares about causality, you really need to sort of care about that. So one of the first things we did is we had I guess I won't go into publisher names, but there was a large search publisher investment that we had. And the question is that should we be investing in this particular campaign category? And we worked with a vendor who had geo-experimentation product, and then that was sort of like our first sort of trial with them. And because we're paying the vendor, the incentive structure is fine, right? Like they're not getting paid on the number of experiments being performed or their revenue of those experiments or something like that. We're paying them like a yearly fee to access this system. And so the incentive structure is quite clean between us and the vendor that we're using for that experimentation. And we basically split the United States into 4 cells, and I would say the economics would probably be quite poor in their favor. I think it was a great lesson for us because that's always the concern. That's how that product gets sold, right? And particularly just with like Canva's goal is to empower the world to design, and we want to empower the world to design, but I don't want to pay for every single person who wants to be empowered to design because we're giving away the product to the majority of people in a sense. On some of these search systems, you actually get to understand your competitors and where they come into the mix and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And we would see one of our competitors spending a unreasonable amount of money trying to sort of like get in there and absolutely seeing no effect to any of the internal metrics that we use to evaluate the success of campaigns. And so this basically brought such certainty of just like, it's not about what the publisher says, it's not about like what our attribution tracking says, it's like we've designed this experiment, we've used experiment design, which is like an incredibly core part of the way Canva has sort of like changed its product through time. And we've basically causally proven we can draw out the relationship between the daily investment and the revenue or the number of users that it brings into the business. And what's interesting about that experiment is that the answer is there actually is some incrementality in being able to change the landing page. So if you're paying a couple of cents for every person that comes through, it may actually be in your economic interest to do that investment. But when you have market forces and a bidding system, and sort of like a limited demand, then that changes the economics of the situation. And so just as, in all of this stuff, there is an element of truth that helps, like, it's not that stuff isn't true. The question is like, at what spin point is it true? And being able to design and build experimentation and sort of like work with publishers to build that experimentation and help include the publisher as part of the experimentation process of like, this is our goal, we want this is, and like you share in the success of our business, and we're trying to get to answer this particular question, and this is how we're going to run an experiment. Do you have any comments and stuff like that? And including them on the journey just is incredibly important. And that sort of like there's the beginning of the journey for Canva, where we have learned that this style of experimentation can actually really help us answer those questions.
Okay, so then you were using attribution a lot, and then you came in and you started doing this new way that's a lot more sophisticated. But can you do this at a small business level as well? Like at a very basic level, I just call this like a basic incrementality test. And I have this funny meme, this midwit meme, around marketing measurement. It's like the novice at the bottom just goes, oh, well, I'll spend money on marketing if it increases this metric, then it's effective. And then on the other end of the extreme scale, the savant, who's basically very much versed in all of this, does the same thing. It's like, well, we allocate money to marketing, and if it rises above baseline, all other things being considered, then that's the effectiveness. And then everybody else in the middle is like arguing over the technicalities of the ways to do it properly. Like, you need to use this MMM or that model or this kind of MTA attribution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, it's like very simple. Like, did we see incremental improvement? Did we see something increase or not? And I think at the heart of it, like, measurement's pretty simple, but 90% of everyone is like in the middle having this argument of the technicalities of which way is best.
But I think, and this is kind of an area that I've thought about a lot, which is like ads experimentation has always been hard, and it is only in the last media attribution world, sort of time, where it's become cheap. Experimentation has always costed you a holdout group. And whether you're delivering pamphlets or you're sending an offer by mail or something along those lines, that style of experimentation has always had a cost attached to it. And we have just lived in this world where it has been incredibly cheap. And the reality is it was probably all the like the hunches people have about how this stuff works was probably true at the beginning, and it has slowly become less true as time goes on.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's very dangerous, because if you've grown up in that environment and in that era using all those sort of tools and relying on that way of measuring your output, then you almost become ingrained, almost behavioral conditioned in a way, institutionalized. And I find that sometimes very, very hard for someone to break away. And that's very uncomfortable because of the sunk cost. So what I'm noticing is that either subconsciously or consciously, there's a lot of people out there who have grown up in that world that are now in a different world. Maybe they can see the new state of how things are right now and where it's going, and including some of these privacy laws and with the future of those. But I find before they switch to that new way of thinking, new way of doing things, they push back and they double down on what they were doing previously, which is kind of irrational, but that's what I've noticed.
I think from an experimentation point of view, like, you have to remember that you are introducing a new cost to a world that was essentially free. And so you don't get a free ride when you're trying to sell this into the business, in a sense. You have to be really targeted of like, here is this big chunk of money, and I want to answer the question of, are we going to halve the budget of this, or are we going to double the budget of this? And I think that's a really good model that we have internally of trying to understand the way we think about investments, is that for this given sort of payback piece of budget, like, is it delivering so much so that we can justify doubling the investment and sort of getting more back? Or do we think the channel is saturated to some sort of capacity and we should actually be halving that investment to keep it sustainable to be part of the media mix?
Yeah, exactly. I find it's kind of like funding things with these thresholds of admission into getting yield and then these diminishing returns on top. And before you exhaust the channel, you test by putting more money into it. So, and I think one of the big things people understand is if you double the budget, it doesn't always double the impact because of that diminishing return to the curve. So it really depends, like, are you past that point of admission, that threshold, and then you're sort of playing the game and you're getting yield, and then how far can I push that one investment before I see these like trailing diminishing returns in the curve? I just got to ask, was there blowback to this? Were some people skeptical, or did you have to get buy-in from finance? Because it seems like you had a lot of autonomy there in terms of decision making.
We're definitely not autonomous. This is as much of a technical problem as it is sort of like an information and bringing people along for the journey problem. And I think what's worked for us is that my coach is an incredibly good communicator, and that was very useful. Having someone who like had been quite established in the business, believes in causality, but might not have the technical skills to sort of push that through, and partnering with someone who believes in that incrementality, but is like more on sort of like, let's seek the best answer we possibly can. And that style of partnership and bringing that style of thinking into the business. But obviously, you've said it yourself, like, your partners in this are everyone, like, you have to have finance on board, and, like, finance at least talks in the realm of return on investment. And so, like, a lot of ad tracking technology, or sorry, ad measurement technology is, like, if the really good stuff is built around the idea of incrementality, and for every dollar in, we get a dollar out and in a time period. And like, that is a language that finance is just so much more excited about than impressions or reach or something along those lines. Like, I'm not saying that those aren't important things to be considerate of depending on the type of campaign and stuff like that, but translating your measurement technology to finance tooling just means you've got a really strong ally in that discussion, because a finance partner is generally trying to help business leaders make a decision about where investment goes and how to sort of make those decisions. But you also have to include like the trafficking teams, the teams that are running it at the same time. And so partnering with them in the experiment design and saying, you and I have exactly the same ambition here, which is like, we want the best outcome for the company. And so I guess like what I'm trying to say here is like, I want to answer the question of should the budget be bigger or smaller? And I think this is a really good way of proving that the budget could potentially, like, maybe we're underinvested in this, but alternatively, if we're saturated, then I think we should have a conversation about where we want to allocate that money for our best interests at the same time.
Okay, so would you say that you're currently doing more of like an MMM model here? I know this is quite vogue at the minute. Some people are talking like media mix modeling or marketing mix modeling. Is that how you are operating right now?
Yeah, so I think that's like the next phase in the story in a sense, right? So we had started building out experimentation as the core capability, and I still say it today, the most important thing we can do as a sort of a data science team or a measurement science team is to support experimentation, because there's this truthiness kind of scale in a sense, right? And real RCTs are at the top, but like no one in marketing no one controls enough pieces to do real RCTs, like full stop.
And RCTs, just for the audience, are random controlled trials.
Yeah, randomized control trials. And like, that's fine, right? Like, I want the drugs that I need to make myself better. I want those to go through RCTs, but it's probably a little bit too expensive for just in the media landscape. But then you can sort of get to sort of quasi-experimentation / causality, and we think about geo experiments, pulse experiments, or switchback experiments as they're sometimes called. And so that is like the next layer of scaling that out. And so we sort of started developing we had a very talented engineer who came up with a new switchback experiment methodology inside of Canva. And so that allowed us to do experimentation on channels where we couldn't do geographic splits. And that's just where you turn the channel on and then off, on and then off, and then you use that with an ad stock curve to try and estimate its incrementality. As we were doing that, we were getting the media sort of tables and stuff like that ready to go into an MMM. And so that's when Canva started exploring into getting into a marketing mix model. And obviously we go for the big markets first. I think I had heard at the beginning of this, it's a 2-year journey to sort of go from having an idea and then like getting your first continuously running report. And I was just like, sure, I can do it faster. And the reality is that it didn't take 2 years, but it definitely took more than a year to sort of go through that entire process, because you just have to change so much of the way you organize the data in your organization to get it to that point. And it took us a while to sort of get everything to that point. But one of the advantages of having experimentation is you don't need the same rigor around cleaning of all of the data to get experimentation up. And so you can start with incrementality testing very early on and owning that yourself. Then you have all of these elasticities of these channel investments that you can then use to calibrate. And so one of the real powerful things about the system that we've developed is that we have the MMM, which is like a large hierarchical regression, right? Like it's just a fancy regression, okay? I understand some people talk about it how it's an operating system or it's like some black box, but it's just a big fancy regression. And all that's happening is it's trying to guess the media investments across all of your tactics. And don't get me wrong, there was this great analogy that I heard at Facebook, which applied to attribution modeling, but I think it is true for market mix modeling as well, which is sort of media modeling is kind of like cooking a steak. If you start with like some Wagyu, really good T-bone cut or something like that, there's only a couple ways you can cook that to break it. Like most of the ways you're going to cook that, it's going to be a really nice meal at the end, right? But if you start with the cheapest rump meat in the entire world, like there's only a couple of ways you can cook that to actually making it into a nice meal. Data quality really matters. And what's great about having an experimentation program is that you causally get these curves of the relationship between daily spend and the value brought to the business. And then you can take those curves and you can calibrate your MMM. So your MMM has to do less guessing around the investments. And your job as a measurement science team is to basically come in and try and like put as much calibration as possible into that model so that it has to guess as few points as possible. So you're starting with a more accurate base model. And the thing is like, you also just need the experience. You need to build up the muscle of like understanding how to do the categorizations of your channels and tactics. And, you know, there's an entire other category of like, how do you estimate what is the value input that you put into the model to optimize towards? Just because there's an entire part of the team that just builds sort of like this value estimation system, because Canva's business is very far away from somewhere that sells socks on the internet. Like, we do technically sell socks on the internet. You can go to canva.com and design something and then have it stitched onto a sock. However, socks are not our core business. It's empowering the world to design, and how you take people who are empowered to design and then value the cost of the ad investment is really like its own sort of piece of science in a sense.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like, I do a lot of work in services, as you know, and sometimes the complexity of that buying cycle is extremely long. So, for example, they could be a free customer for 3 years and then after 3 years convert. And that could be a lot of your user base. So if you're measuring in a very small window of time and trying to measure things there in terms of your payback period, or some people call it return on investment, then you get all these kind of inaccuracies seeping into your measurement methodology. And even with these yield curves of different channel investments and the diminishing returns, I find a lot of media are very dynamic as well. So things will change over time. So it's really hard to look at a previous period and then compare that with the current yields that you're getting. Like Facebook or Google, for example, have had very sudden and abrupt changes in their yields with updates to their systems. So I find you might have a model with everything calibrated, but then you have to recalibrate and constantly test and retest those things to make sure they're still valid. And I was just talking to Recast founder Michael Kaminsky the other day on his podcast, and he's like, the number one issue is the quality of the data available to shove into the model by far.
Data and like, there's now vendors that specialize in this stuff, right? MMM vendors build their own technology around this stuff. Internal businesses build their own sort of technology. And then another class of vendors that sort of take all of your media information and then give you a nice interface to sort of normalize it and stuff like that as well. The reality is like almost all, one of the real value adds that any of these MMM vendors add is their ability to do this media classification stuff and helping you along that journey. Because going from 0 to 1 in that space is a lot harder and a lot more challenging than people think. They're just like, oh, the hard part is like productionizing the model or something. It's just like, no, it's all the messy human stuff. Unfortunately, as always, is the thing that's hard.
Like trying to get accurate reports when you're a publisher or something like that. Well, again, thanks for coming on the show, Sam, and all the best. I hope to talk again soon.